Hello, everyone. It's me, Jen, and I am here with Sarah Penner, who is the author of the fantastic London Seance Society. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Jen. Thank you so much for having me on today.
No problem. So Sarah and I were just saying pre-call that we're the wrong way round because obviously I've gone gothy as usual, although I've put my cape on to be a bit extra gothy. Going to try not to start any fires with my candle next to me. And Sarah, who has written this fantastically gothy book about seances in Victorian London, is in hot pink over there.
Yep. Hot pink, and it's bright and sunny outside and in my house. And it's funny because I'm really a very cheerful, upbeat person, but both of the books that I've written, the London Seance Society and then my debut, The Lost Apothecary, they both have darker themes to them. And the London Seance Society is a lot of death and ghosts, but here I am in my real element, which is a lot of hot pink and bright energy.
I wanted to ask you about this a little bit, actually, Sarah. I mean, obviously, you're an American in 2023 in hot pink,
Mm-hmm.
bringing the happy vibes. What made you want to write about historical London and the more macabre?
Yes. So I've always been an Anglophile. So, here in America, so many of us readers, Philippa Gregory, one of my favorite authors, I kind of grew up reading her. And I think readers that lean toward that type of genre, we romanticize British history. We envision the castles and the old alleyways, and the reality is that so many things in the city of London are older than the country that I live in. And so what that means is London's history is so much more interesting to me than the areas where I grew up and the areas that I'm really familiar with. And so I've always loved London historical fiction. And therefore, when I decided to start writing, there was no other city that even came to mind. I just knew that I wanted my first two books to be set in London. And particularly with this second book, the one we're talking about today, I knew I wanted to write a ghost story and I knew I wanted it to be set in London. And if you have those two things, you almost can't avoid the Victorian era because they were so enamored of ghosts. They were obsessed with the occult and the paranormal. The wealthy were always having seances for their rich friends in their parlor rooms. And so all of that for me, even though I'm an American writer, it's just kind of it has this romantic vibe to it and this very eerie atmospheric feeling. And that's why I've always been drawn to London's history.
And they definitely were quite spooky, the Victorians. But I do agree with you. I was over in America at the end of last year and looking at things that are historic, and it says kind of, oh, this is really historic. It's from 1890, and it's kind of everything we have is older than that. Probably have spices in my cupboard older than that.
Yes.
Did you come over and do any research trips, or how did you make sure you were writing kind of accurately?
Yeah, so I've been to London countless times. I have a background in finance. My writing was not my chosen career path. I kind of found myself as a writer through an interesting way. I have 13 years in finance, but I've always loved to write. I've always kept a journal. And I decided about 8 years ago that I was going to take some creative writing classes. And one thing led to another, and I ended up writing my debut novel, The Lost Apothecary. But the reason I say that is because during my time in the corporate world, we had a derivatives trading office very near St. Paul's Cathedral. And so I would stay in that area and walk the whole city. I remember one time I was training for a half marathon and I ended up running 11 miles, and I went everywhere from Buckingham Palace to like the East End, like just all over. But I've always loved just kind of walking the city on foot, looking at the old pubs. I went mudlarking along the River Thames a few years ago, which that's something that happens in my first book. So I've definitely spent a lot of time in the city, kind of trying to familiarize myself and going to the old museums and what have you.
Brilliant. Although I guess it is I asked kind of how accurately were you kind of writing and how much research have you done, but really I guess we don't know how accurate it was it is to back then anyway. Was there a character that you particularly had fun writing? I loved Is it Vaudeline?
Vaudeline. Yep. Different people have said different things. I say Vaudeline, but some people say Vaudeline, and I think anything is great. But yet I know I saw that she was one of your favorite characters, and she was the very first character that came to my mind for this book, because as I was reading about spiritualism in the Victorian era, one thing that I learned that really interested me was that this was one of the only professions in which women were more respected than men, because women were viewed as more open and amicable toward spirits, whereas men were viewed as too arrogant and closed off to allow their psyche to be taken under control of a spirit. And so when I learned that, I immediately knew I was onto something with this very powerful, highly esteemed international medium. However, I wanted her to be not from London, because I needed to kind of build up the story's stakes in that way. So I decided to make her Parisian, and she's very beautiful. She's kind of a seductress, and she works with police and families who are trying to figure out what happened to their loved ones. But she was the first character that came to mind, and I was able to really build her as richly and powerful as I possibly wanted, because so many women were able to command a lot of respect from gentlemen during the Victorian era if they were in this profession.
And I think Vaudeline, she seems kind of in her supernatural powers, but also in her confidence and her sexuality. She's very unapologetic, isn't she? She knows when she has to hide things, but she is also not keeping them secret. She's hiding them where she needs to, but she's not ashamed of them. Did you know straight away that you wanted to kind of have an LGBT theme running through the book? Was that important to you to include?
Yeah, from the very early days that this book idea started to simmer in my brain, I knew there was going to be a romantic element between the spiritualist Vaudeline and Lena, essentially her apprentice. And I knew I wanted Vaudeline to kind of be the teacher in many ways, and Lena she's trying to explore her belief or disbelief in a lot of different realms of her life. So one of those is whether she believes in ghosts, but I also loved the idea of having this young woman in such a repressive Victorian London society, who essentially is being told she has no other choice but to be with a man and kind of work in the family business someday. And I loved the idea of her feeling discontent because she doesn't like the boys that she's getting to hang out with and kiss and court. She just doesn't feel anything for them. And then suddenly she meets this beautiful woman and she does feel something, and she feels what she's heard you're supposed to be feeling. So I loved exploring that. And that was always part of the story. And at one juncture with my editor, she didn't challenge, but she just asked me, she said, "Are you sure you want to do this, Sarah? Because on my social media, I'm married to a man and I present as kind of a heterosexual woman. And so we've seen in the industry some conflict when, particularly around race. If someone is a certain race, but they're trying to write a protagonist that's another race, they might come under fire." So my team just wanted to be very sure. And they said, "Sarah, are you sure you want to have an LGBT element here?" And I said, "Absolutely. I'm willing to take the heat if I get it." And thankfully I really haven't. But I just knew it was crucial to the story. And so there was no other option for me.
I think as a queer woman, I think it's really well done. And I also challenge anybody to not have a crush on Vaudeline, because she is a spooky fox.
Yep.
Yeah, she really is. So talking about Lena and believing in magic, and she's starting to explore whether or not she believes in magic. Do you believe in magic, Sarah?
So I don't believe in magic. And as for ghosts, I don't not believe, but I'm a skeptic because I haven't had a personal experience. However, a lot of my family and friends that I respect greatly have relayed to me stories that are really convincing and detailed stories about ghostly experiences that they've had. And so I believe that there's something there that I just simply haven't tapped into yet. And I'm waiting for the day, but it's interesting because I go to so many of these different events and I tell my audiences, I'm a skeptic, but I want to believe. And so many of them will come up to me afterwards and just tell me brief stories that leave me with chills running down my arms, because I really believe there is something else at play. But for whatever reason, my perceptiveness isn't advanced enough to tap into that.
Have you considered going to any seances of your own?
So I went to a seance.
Okay.
Yeah, my mother and I, when I was early days researching this book, we went to a seance, and I walked in kind of hoping that I would experience something so convincing or tangible that I would be able to say forevermore, I am a believer in ghosts. Sadly, that didn't happen, but I did get to see something that I didn't expect, which was several families had gone to this seance because it was part of their grieving process, and they were trying to connect with people that they had loved and lost, and they were finding a lot of peace and fulfillment from this process. And so I had not expected that. I assumed that everyone in the seance room, like me, was maybe for entertainment value or research purposes like myself. But it was very emotional to see what brought people to that experience. And I was able to then capture some of those feelings in the book.
Brilliant. I think it's really well done, and it's really interesting. People who haven't read the book really should, because it really does play on that, how much of a seance is genuine and how much of it is somebody taking advantage of somebody at a very kind of vulnerable part of their lives. And you never really get kind of a clear answer in the book about how much of it is supernatural.
That's right.
It isn't.
And that's intentional. There are absolutely scenes in the book where the reader, and the characters for that matter, are supposed to kind of ask themselves, is what just happened real, or is it an illusion? And that's a lot of fun for me as a writer to put those scenes in, because I love when readers turn the page and they're kind of guessing or questioning what's happening in front of them.
So you mentioned a little bit about your journey to becoming an author. Mm-hmm. And I noticed as well that you have kind of resources on your website for other people who are writing, which I really like. Mm-hmm. Did you feel like, coming to writing in a slightly non-traditional way, there were any kind of blockers for you or boundaries in starting to write?
You know, I think the biggest boundary for me in the beginning is that straight out of university until my I'm 36 now, so I guess it would have been until about age 32, I had a day job. So I had to be at work at a desk every day at 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. And that's absolutely a hindrance to the time that it takes to write a novel. So I had two options. I could either work on my book before work, or I could work on it after work. And I quickly learned that I couldn't write after work because I was too mentally tapped out. By the time I had showered and gotten dinner on the table, it's like the last thing you want to do is sit down and write. But I've always been a little bit of a morning person. And so I started waking up at 5 a.m. every day, and I would fix myself a cup of coffee, sit down at my desk while the house is dark and the dog is asleep and my husband is asleep. And I would start writing for about 2.5 hours. And as it turns out, if you do that for a year before the workday, you will have a book at the end of it. And I think what I viewed as a hindrance at the time, now I'm so glad, because I realized I had more dedication and desire to achieve this than I had thought. And you really have to, if people are listening and they want to write a book, the reality is our days are so busy. We are all just booked hour to hour, and you're going to have to carve out time somewhere, and you're going to have to sacrifice something. So being able to sit down and ask yourself, is this important enough that I'm willing to sacrifice sleep or time with my family or my friends And if it is that important to you, you should do it and you should pursue it. And I'm glad that I had to make that choice, because I proved to myself what's important to me.
This is it, isn't it? I think every time I ask writers for tips, and I hear people asking writers for tips, we hope that somebody's going to come up with this genius thought of, oh, here's how to turn 15 minutes into 3 hours. But the reality is, unfortunately, you have to make time, whether that's like you did, getting up early, or whether it's, you know, giving up something at the weekend to write. There really is no way around it other than finding that time. Would that be your biggest tip to somebody that is trying to write?
So my biggest tip for someone who's trying to write is try to start making writing a daily practice. And that can be journaling, that can be keeping a diary or a blog, or even just like lengthy social media posts. But so many people, they have it on their bucket list to have a published book. But then when they actually sit down to write, they realize, I don't like this. This is tedious. This is time consuming. This is taxing on my brain. And so my advice to writers who are early in their career is just make sure you really like it first. And the best way to make sure you like writing is to try and sit down and write for at least an hour every single day and see how it goes. And hopefully it's really fulfilling. And if not, then there are plenty of other hobbies and things that you can do instead.
If you don't like it, then you probably don't want to be a writer.
That's right. That's right.
Great tip. So what are you reading at the moment, Sarah? Do you have a book of the year so far?
So today, the book that I am most looking forward to of the whole year comes out in the United States. It's called The Wager by David Grann, and it's actually narrative nonfiction, which might be surprising because I do, of course, read a lot of fiction. I read a lot of historical fiction and mysteries and thrillers and what have you. But narrative nonfiction is my favorite genre. I love reading compelling stories about things that really happened. And this book that comes out today called The Wager, it's about a shipwreck and off of the coast of Patagonia, and kind of this mutinous altercation that breaks out. Obviously, since it just came out, I haven't read it, so I can't share a whole lot more, but I'm so excited for that. I'm also reading the book called Loyalty, which released a few weeks ago by Lisa Scottolini. I'm not sure when it will be out in the UK, or maybe it already is, but that takes place in 19th century Sicily, and it's historical fiction. So those are two things that I've kind of got on my plate right now.
That's very exciting. Do you read nonfiction and use it as a setting for your potential fiction? Should we maybe expect a shipwreck theme, Sarah?
Yes, you should expect a shipwreck theme. That's my third book. My third book takes place on the Amalfi Coast in Italy. And so I'm departing from the atmospheric back alleyways of London for my third book. And I am writing a story in which there's a coven of witches who live along the sea, and there's a slew of mysterious shipwrecks. And present day, there is a maritime archaeologist who is excavating one of these wrecks and trying to discover if there's a connection between this coven of witches from 200 years ago and some strange happenings along the Amalfi Coast. So that's what I'm writing right now. And I'm absolutely loving it, because in order to excavate these shipwrecks, she's a scuba diver, and my husband and I are scuba divers, and we've gone diving in a lot of shipwrecks. So this has been such a fun book to write for me. That
sounds incredibly creepy, but also like loads of fun. That's a really good read. We've just done a read along of London Seance Society, and our readers really loved it. Some of them even got into baking Victorian funeral biscuits.
Wonderful.
And they have sent a couple of questions for you. So somebody asks, what made you want to merge the supernatural and murder mystery?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when people ask me what genre I write, I sometimes struggle to answer the question, because I think I write cross-genre stories. So exactly like you just said, Jen, I write murder mysteries that also weave in elements of either magical realism or the supernatural. And the reason why is because there's so much in our day-to-day life that I think is inexplicable. We can't assign logic or reason to it. So we've all been in a room where all of a sudden we feel like a cold draft, or maybe we think of someone that we haven't talked to in years, and all of a sudden they text us out of the blue. These things happen all over the world to all sorts of people every single day. And as we were kind of talking about earlier, it does leave me wondering if there's some plane or frequency or element to the universe that we haven't fully tapped into yet. And so when I write my stories and I weave in these elements of magic or supernatural, I think it's because there's a bit of a dreamer in me that feels like there is some of those are real. We just don't know where they start and end. Mm-hmm. And I think it makes for a more interesting story when the characters are asking themselves what's real and what's not. So I can't fathom ever writing a book in which there's not some sort of element of that. And I think readers have also come to expect that from me now. So, you know, my first book was magic. This seance book is paranormal. My third book has witchcraft. So all of my books, I think, will have some sort of element of this. And I love that. I think it's part of who I am as a writer.
I love the way that you meld that so closely with the strong female characters supporting each other and kind of being each other's lifeline. It feels so mixed in with the magic and the supernatural. Like with your next book, with it being a coven, with this, it being a seance group, it feels that they are so supportive of each other, but almost more than just a standard kind of friendship that you would expect in another fiction book.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think my books are also feminist in nature. And so we see groups of women banding together, or maybe not even groups, but just 2 or 3 women. I really also like the teacher apprentice model of having kind of a woman who is older and wiser, and she's training or helping someone who's younger. So I really like that as well. But if I can weave in those feminist elements, that's just another thing that I want to kind of claim as my own when I think about my brands.
Yeah, I love that. And I think mixed with historical fiction, especially, it's so important. And I think it makes it immensely readable. Something else a reader asked us was, do you see this as a standalone, or are we going to see your characters again? Now, I am obviously instantly obsessed with the idea of Vaudeline on a shipwreck, but are we going to see Vaudeline again?
So I don't yet have plans to write a sequel for this book, although I think that the ending sets it up perfectly. And I don't want to give away any spoilers, but there's definitely an easy way in to write a sequel. But there's so many fresh and different story ideas that I'm excited to tell, that I think I will have to just give that some thought at another time. But right now, you know, the 2 characters, they're kind of off doing their things. So we shall see if they come back to me in some way in the future.
I love that. That's a really good answer. Right. That is everything. Thank you so much for chatting with me, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Jen. This has been great.